I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we report on the dramatic shift in rhetoric from President Zelensky towards any future peace deal, and hear about Ukraine's so-called mobilisation police and the effect they are having among young Ukrainian men.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong. Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 2nd of December, 2 years and 288 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes and freelance journalist Anna Conkling, a regular contributor to The Telegraph who splits her time between Berlin and Kyiv. I started with the latest news from the battlefield. Over the weekend, minimal gains on the ground, very little on the ground. Russia still pushing west in the Donbass. That's their main effort by the look of things. They are moving west, but it's by hundreds of meters, if that, over the weekend. Very, very little. A couple of other things, though. On Sunday, a Russian drone hit a civilian bus in the centre of Kherson city, killed 3, injured 8. This comes from local authorities there. The attack occurred about 8:15 in the morning, local time. There were 15 people in the bus at the time of the strike. Now, obviously, Kherson and the surrounding area we've seen in the last few months, we've reported it here, what's been dubbed this human safari, where Russian FPV, first-person view drones, seem to be just deliberately targeting civilians. So I've seen some images, can't verify them, but images of a large yellow civilian bus with a big hole in the roof and some of the windows blown out. Maybe it's part of that. I don't understand why the world is not picking up on this. Looking at you, UN, again. Then overnight, last night, Sunday to Monday, 4 killed, 23 wounded across the whole country. 110 drones fired last night. 52 were shot down. 50 brought down by electronic warfare, 6 routed back to Belarus and Russia. And then of the 2 that got through, 1 hit an apartment building in Ternopil, that's right over in the west, about 100 kilometres east of Lviv. That accounted for 1 of the dead. I'm not sure where the other drone landed or the result. Then, next report is Russia is said to have fired at least 60 North Korean-supplied ballistic missiles since the start of the full-scale invasion. This comes from Ukrainian military spokesperson speaking to Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Speaking earlier today, this was Andrei Cherniak. He said their accuracy, in principle, is not very high. We understand that the technology with which they were manufactured is outdated. Now, that element, the improving ballistic missile technology, is almost certainly one of the areas Russia has done the deal, made promises to North Korea in return for weapons and men to fight in, well, certainly in Kursk and possibly also in Ukraine. North Korean men who, according to President Zelensky, have suffered their first losses. Now, he made that claim in an interview yesterday with Japanese news agency Kyodo News, but he didn't give any further details or put numbers on it. Now then, on the diplomatic front, a lot of movement there, so let's dig into this. Firstly, bang up to date today, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, he arrived in Kyiv this morning. It's his first visit since June 2022. German TV news channel NTV reported him as saying, "I would like to make it clear here on the ground that Germany will remain Ukraine's strongest supporter in Europe." He pledged, now this is words from NTV. He said he promised an additional 650 million euros worth of arms supplies. That's about 680 million US dollars. And in their piece, NTV also say that according to German government figures, German weapons and military equipment worth around 28 billion euros, big B billion euros, have been delivered or promised to Ukraine since the start of the full-scale invasion. Now, I've tried to dig into this morning. I don't think that can be just from Germany. 28 billion euros is a huge number. I don't recognise that number as just coming from Germany, and I wonder if they're being a little cute there and counting things like the value of the Leopard tanks that have been given by other nations. Bit cheeky if that's what they have done. They also say, so this 650 million euros that Chancellor Scholz has pledged today, they're saying will be delivered in December. I mean, it's December now. I don't know if this is new money. I don't know if this is what they're talking about, the stuff that will have been delivered by the end of this year, or if this is new stuff. Now, they're talking about an RST air defence system and more Leopard 1 tanks and a few other bits and pieces, which is all good. I mean, I'm not knocking it. But if it's new money, another 650 million, that's great. But if they're just totting up what they've already pledged and saying that all that stuff that will be delivered by the end of this month amounts to 650, that's just a little bit sharp with the numbers. So overwhelmingly good. But I think once you dig into the detail, there might be a few little gremlins under the rocks. Anyway, Chancellor Scholz said this morning, Germany is doing more this year than Great Britain and France combined. You could even add a few more countries to that. Now, on the one hand, I'm happy if there's some sort of political ego-driven contest for who can give the most aid. But on the other, I say those comments mask a lot. Aid is great, but what is it, where is it, and when is it? And of course, the one thing that Ukraine has been crying out for this year from Germany is the Taurus cruise missile and policy permissions to fire it into Russia, and no move on that. Now, in response, President Zelensky said on Twitter, "We are deeply grateful to Germany for all the assistance it has provided. Germany stands as a European leader in supporting Ukraine, helping us defend ourselves against Russian aggression and terror." He put something out on his Twitter channel. He went around with Chancellor Scholz, went to, well, among other places, went to a medical facility, met some wounded soldiers. I mean, it's all on Twitter. I hope it's not selective use of photography, because Chancellor Scholz looks extremely uncomfortable at meeting these service personnel who've lost legs, I think, from the images. And then there's a sort of group, a family photo type thing when everyone's lined up. And yeah, I know this is not a laughing matter at all, but even President Zelensky is smiling in that photo. And Chancellor Scholz looks like he's just choked on his bratty. Anyway, you'll find all that online. And also over the weekend, Zelensky met Kaja Kallas, the EU's new head of diplomacy, alongside Antonio Costa, the brand new president of the European Council. They also were visiting Kyiv. Now, on the way there, Kaja Kallas spoke to reporters on the train, and she said that for Ukraine, quote, "the strongest security guarantee is NATO membership. We definitely need to discuss this. If Ukraine decides to draw the line somewhere, then how can we secure peace so that Putin doesn't go any further?" Now, President Zelensky said that Ukraine needs security guarantees from NATO and more weapons to defend itself before any talks with Russia. Speaking yesterday with Ms. Kallas and Antonio Costa, he said, "An invitation for Ukraine to join NATO is a necessary thing for our survival. If we will have a frozen conflict without any strong position for Ukraine, Putin will come back in 2, 3 or 5 years." Now, this continues a bit of a trend over the weekend. He seems to have shifted ground quite dramatically, or at the very least opened a crack in his hitherto maximalist position of ejecting every Russian from every inch of Ukrainian territory. Now, there is a new tone to the rhetoric around any future peace deal. So briefly, on Friday, he gave an interview to Sky News where he was talking about, he started this phrase, the hot phase of the war. So we're going to hear this more and more, so let's get our heads around it. He talked about NATO membership for the rest of Ukraine, so not the occupied territories. He said, "If we want to stop the hot phase of the war, we need to take under the NATO umbrella the territory of Ukraine that we have under our control. We need to do it fast, and then on the occupied territory of Ukraine, Ukraine can get them back in a diplomatic way." Quite a shift in position. So he was giving that interview with the, as I say, Japanese news agency Kyodo News yesterday. And in that, he said Ukraine might have to use diplomatic means to liberate the rest of the country. Asked about taking back the Russian-held areas by force, he said, "Our army lacks the strength to do that. That is true. We do have to find diplomatic solutions." So any way you dress this up, this is a very, very significant shift, I think, in his language. I note that this week, in fact, tomorrow, Tuesday and Wednesday, there's the NATO foreign ministerial meeting. Undoubtedly, the topic of Ukrainian NATO membership will come up. I wonder what will be said in the light of this new position. So, I'm keen on our guest's view on this shortly, but why is he saying it now? I think there's a number of reasons. Number one, the context is Donald Trump and his inauguration on the 20th of January. We've done that to death, but that is setting the, if not setting the agenda, it is setting the context for diplomatic manoeuvres at the moment. Secondly, exhaustion, Ukrainian exhaustion and Russian, and the reality, possibly for now, an assessment that nothing's shifting on the lines. As I say, Russia is moving west in certain areas to a very small degree. I mention that because it is happening. I don't want you to think that we're not giving all the news, but actually the lines aren't shifting. And I think there's a reality, an acceptance of that reality for now. I think there's also an assessment of Putin's need for a deal. Now, they're not saying anything different from their maximalist position, or Putin's not saying anything different to his wants to take over the whole country because it's riddled with drug dealers and Nazis and all the rest of it. But of course, they are exhausted. They are turning to North Korea, Iran, China, as we've said. He's desperate not to mobilise the middle classes in the cities of St. Petersburg, Moscow, and that kind of thing. But Putin wants a way out of this as well, but probably in order to come back in 10 years. I'm not doubting that, but he's looking for an acceptable compromise now, and Ukraine will know that. And I also wonder, finally, whether or not now, with this exhaustion, we're nearly 3 years in, we'll hear from Anna shortly about the view from the front lines, but I wonder if there is now political room for Zelensky to raise these ideas. It would have been unthinkable a couple of years ago, possibly even a few months ago, to raise this idea. He's had to hold that maximalist position. And I wonder now if he's got a little bit of wiggle room to raise these ideas without everyone screaming, oh my God, you're selling us out, get out, let's get Zelensky in, or what have you. Now, how would this work? What might it work like? The chat that I've seen in recent weeks, galvanised over the weekend, there were basically three models of what some sort of post-conflict Ukraine might look like. There's the Taiwan model, which is sometimes called the porcupine, i.e. you arm the country to the teeth so that Russia, and obviously in the Taiwan model it's China's the belligerent, but in this model it's Russia, thinks that's too unpalatable a prize to try and bite off. It's going to cost too much. Then there's a South Korea model, which is whereby you put your own troops in there. There's 50,000 US troops based in South Korea. So you put your own troops in, Western troops, in which case they either act as a trip line, or there's just that ambiguity that's put into the mind of Putin that if something happens and Western troops, NATO troops are killed, is that Article 5. And then there's the West Germany model. Of course, during the Cold War, what was then West Germany joined NATO, even with East Germany still occupied by the then Soviet Union. So this idea that, oh no, you can't have some part of NATO, some part of Ukraine in NATO with some part of it out, that's just too messy. What does that look like on a map? Well, it looks like West Germany. It looks like West and East Germany. I'm flying over, I'm wave topping here because we haven't got a huge amount of time, and this will come up again and again, I'm sure. But I do think it is too easy to say you couldn't allow Ukraine into NATO with Russian troops on its soil, just in terms of geography. I know there's a lot more to NATO membership, but that model has been tried before. In West Germany, it seemed to do all right then. Now then, what would that mean, though? It would be an acceptance that borders in Europe and the world can be redrawn by force, and I wonder if that is a dangerous precedent. So anyway, lots to talk about. Thankfully, I've got some beefy brain boxes here to throw some ideas around. Joe, welcome back to the pod. Been a few days. What do you think of this shift in rhetoric from Zelensky? How is he able to do it now? I mentioned he's got political wiggle room. Is it just as simple as that, or is there more going on? And is it everything shifting because of Donald Trump coming in? Just everyone's trying to get their positions in place before the 20th of Jan. Welcome back, Joe.
Yeah, and I really do think this concept of whether it be partial NATO membership, partial Article 5 coverage, which isn't a new thing, I'll come back to that later, is just as much about Ukraine running out of men, running out of weapons, running out of Western backing, than it is the prospect of Zelensky setting the conditions for whatever negotiation might come. Is he actually trying to hamstring the likes of Donald Trump, who would probably take matters into his own hands and negotiate over the heads of Zelensky, well, and Putin if he could? But then there's other countries. It's not calling for peace talks. We've heard, I think, over the weekend that there's been numerous European countries have raised it privately with Zelensky about why don't you go to the table now? It's probably time. So that's interesting. Then let's look at the terminology. So Zelensky said a NATO umbrella. So NATO Article 5, that guarantees, it's basically the clause in NATO's founding treaty, North Atlantic Treaty, that says an attack on one is an attack on all. And basically, if someone, in this case, Ukraine, is given NATO membership and Russia decides to attack, the rest of NATO would have to go in and help out its ally Ukraine militarily. Is that going to happen? Probably not. The US, even under Joe Biden, was blocking an invitation being given to Ukraine for membership. Not membership, an invitation. Germany also blocked that. So you've got its leading partner, the US, and it's one of its strongest European allies, sort of, guess you can box Germany, Britain and France together in certain aspects, saying no. So maybe they're willing to look at other possibilities, as Dom was speaking about, the partial coverage. So the ceasefire option, you freeze the conflict where it is, take into acknowledgement that Ukraine doesn't control the entirety of its territory. I think the number is it's just short, it's between 18 and 20% at the moment, is the amount of territory that is controlled by Russian forces in Ukraine. And that is figures and analysis by Deep State, which is a Ukrainian website. Then we look at the idea of that 80%, let's say, covered by NATO, probably not going to happen, as I said. But then could you do something like an Article 5 style guarantee, where you have a coalition of the willing, let's say, by all intents and purposes, the UK, France, Poland, the Baltic states. This is something that was muted by Boris Johnson in his interview with Dom and Francis last week, where you basically have peacekeepers on the ground, but with a commitment from those peacekeepers that if Russia does try and attack, lethal force would come into play and you would bring in your militaries to head off that. Could happen, but probably still a long way away. I don't see any willingness from anyone to really put their soldiers in harm's way, given the political climate. So the idea of partial NATO membership is actually something that's not new inside Zelensky's head. He's been fed this idea by former NATO Secretary General Anders Rasmussen, who as far back as November 2023 was muting this idea. Rasmussen's been working alongside Zelensky basically to build up an argument to get Ukraine into NATO. And then I think what's also interesting is Zelensky is open to the idea of partial Article 5 membership, coverage of Article 5. So over the weekend he said, we understand that Article 5, when you're a member of NATO, cannot apply to the entire territory of Ukraine during wartime, as countries are against the risks of being drawn into the war. But he also said there can be no NATO invitation to only a part of Ukrainian territory. So he's basically saying, look, if you want to do Article 5 partially, that's fine with us. But we're not going to accept, essentially, the West German model. He says the entirety of Ukraine has to be in NATO, which is something that's basically going to, at any negotiating table, Putin is going to say, no way, Jose, on. And it's interesting to see what Zelensky's language and who he is targeting. We think of Donald Trump being the main sort of target for this, but actually, he went on to say in his press conference alongside Kaja Kallas and Antonio Costa, the EU's travelling chiefs over the weekend, Zelensky said, there are 2 months left in the current administration in the United States. They have influence on those few European skeptics of our future in NATO. So he's actually talking to Biden. He's not talking to Donald Trump, who potentially would not entertain NATO membership anyway for Ukraine. He's basically almost potentially the desperation's come out and he's seeing Biden doing more for Ukraine, whether it be ATACMS, allowing sort of American assistance on Storm Shadow, etc. Maybe this is the time to target Biden, and that's hence why the diplomacy's come out at this moment in time. I think it's interesting, but ultimately I think this is Zelensky setting out his red lines for negotiations. We always look at enticing Putin to the negotiating table and what would it take from his point of view to come to the talks. But Zelensky isn't ready to talk yet. He might be saying so, but he is only ready to do it on his parameters. And this is essentially him strengthening that point of view to make sure he isn't bounced into talks by the West.
Yeah, interesting, Joe. I mean, you say he's not ready to talk, but by opening the lid on some of this stuff and allowing these ideas to just fizz off all over the place and get people like us, gobs on sticks, talking about it, I mean, it's interesting that he's kind of lost, or not lost control, but he's just opened up all these ideas. Anyway, it'll be interesting to see where they fizz off to. Just before you go, Joe, Kaja Kallas, so the EU's new head of diplomacy. She was very well regarded when she was Prime Minister of Estonia. How influential do you think she and that position can be? If the art of diplomacy is to talk softly and carry a big stick, the EU doesn't have a big stick, really. Got a bit of sanctuary type stuff going on, but there's no heavy metal behind the EU. So what influence can Kaja Kallas have? Or are we still listening to her because of what she did as Prime Minister of Estonia?
I'm actually a big fan of Kaja Kallas. She's a really bright thinker. It was her idea. It might have not worked as perceived, and that's because the sort of the EU machine is a sort of a clunky beast at times. But it was her idea to create a system amongst where the EU pools its resources to try and generate 1 million shells for Ukraine. based on the idea of what the EU did for coronavirus vaccines. And like, Estonia is tiny. There is no doubt about it. It's one of the smallest, unconsequential countries in the EU by far. And it's before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you would hardly hear about Estonia. It's a beautiful country. I love Tallinn. Great people, great culture. So not criticising them, but as a player in the EU, it was very, very nominal. But as soon as that kicked off, the war kicked off, Putin invaded Ukraine, Kaja Kallas single-handedly dragged Estonia into this sort of heavyweight position. So she carries an awful lot of clout, especially when it comes to the ideas of Russia and talking about Russia and Ukraine. Yes, the EU doesn't have massive foreign policy clout. It is a sanctioning machine. It has a massive economy that trades with the rest of the world. So yes, sanctions are massive. I think there's like over 300 billion euros worth of frozen Russian assets inside Europe, which is massive. The EU itself is trying to be a bit of a foreign policy military player, whether it be through sort of joint European projects to build up military production. Not quite working because a lot of member states don't want to surrender their national sovereignty on defence to Brussels. But there are things that she can do and she can lead. I think she's going to find herself butting heads with Ursula von der Leyen a lot of the time because basically Kaja Kallas is, on paper, the top diplomat of the EU, top foreign diplomat. But a lot of what von der Leyen has done is picture herself as this sort of big geopolitical leader of the EU. She's championed Ukraine as much as Kaja Kallas has. So I think that you'll find there'll be butting heads on ideas, on sort of rhetoric. But ultimately, it's down to the EU's member states to really get their acts in order when it comes to the EU's foreign policy and basically defence production and stuff like that. Because unless they surrender all of their national sovereignty to Brussels, we won't see much movement in that field for the foreseeable future.
Thanks, Joe. Very happy for you to stick around for final thoughts if you wish, but if you've got to dash off, then no problem. Delighted now to introduce Anna Conkling, regular contributor to The Telegraph, Daily Beast and others. Spent most of this year in Ukraine, and as I understand it, you split your time basically between Ukraine and Berlin. Be really keen on your thoughts and everything we've just been discussing, but you and I were chatting earlier. We ran a piece, Telegraph ran a piece last week about efforts by Ukraine to increase the number of soldiers in the armed forces. The piece we ran was titled, "Like Dealing with Cornered Rats, the Men Who Force Ukrainians to the Front Lines." We'll put the link in the episode notes for today. Now, in your many visits to Ukraine, as we were chatting, I know you've come across these so-called mobilisation police. I'd be interested in your view on what they do and what the reaction is from Ukrainian society. Welcome to the pod, Anna.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I think throughout this whole year, it's gotten worse for Ukrainian men in terms of Textica, these mobilization police. Around May is when they started really cracking down on Ukrainian men. And I've heard stories of men just being pulled off the street and forced into vans and then taken straight to the front lines. I think that a lot of men are scared because they don't want to die on the front lines. They don't want to get injured on the front lines. So a lot of men are actually just staying at home. They're hiding in their apartments. They don't want to go out to bars with their friends. They don't want to go just on normal walks or go into the metro because they're too afraid that they're going to be abducted by these Textica officers. And once they are abducted, I've heard stories of men not being given their phones, men not being able to contact their relatives to tell them where they're going. And then a few days later, people just finding that they had been sent to the front lines.
Yeah, now in the piece we ran, we also showed some footage of this, of people being manhandled. So let's just get the numbers here. So at the moment, men aged 18 to is it 60 or 55 are not able to leave the country. Ukraine is trying to mobilise. They've reduced the age from 27 to 25 of the mobilisation age, but that is not every single person. I think all men in those brackets have to register. Is that correct? They have to tell the authorities where they are, where they live, etc., etc. But they're not all immediately drafted into the armed forces, given a uniform, and off you go. So I think that is the case in terms of the legal policy. But then you do have some of these instances of people being manhandled. Now, is that to get them to show that they have registered, or as you say, and as was written in this piece, some people are taken there and then and taken to a barracks? I mean, is that actually happening, and how widespread is it? Or is it just getting people to then show their status in effect?
Well, I think it's worth mentioning that legally they're supposed to register, but there are a lot of men in Ukraine that aren't registered. They never went in to be registered at the beginning of the war because they've been afraid since the beginning that they would be sent to the front lines. I personally haven't seen the Texaco officers actually take men, but I've heard stories from my colleagues of places like in Kros, which is near the front lines, of men being taken and they're crying, asking, please don't take me, I don't want to go. And I've seen the Texaco officers when I've been driving through checkpoints going into Donbass, and they haven't ever had any problems with my fixers personally. But yeah, I've heard a lot of stories, and even in Kyiv, which is supposed to be safer from these officers than places like Kharkiv or Pokrovsk, there are still stories of men that are just being taken. And I know a few of my colleagues in Ukraine have had friends that have also been taken. And again, they just don't know where they're going. And I think that what Texaco says a lot is that they're taking men to be registered to be in the military. But once they're actually taken in, it's not ever 100% sure if they're going to be let go afterwards.
Yeah, just to my mind, it just seems such an inefficient way of doing it. We were in Ukraine a couple of weeks ago, and I was hosted by a military unit, so it didn't really apply there. But I've also been in taxis in Kyiv and what have you, and it's a big old place, and a lot of the people I interact with are of fighting age, and yet having these squads go around and pick people off the streets and say, right, prove to me that you've registered. It seems such an inefficient way of doing it. Garners such bad publicity, or maybe it's there as a way of shocking people in order to get them to register. Do you know if there's any sort of bigger scheme behind it? Because it seems like just on the numbers alone, it's just not really going to come up with the hundreds of thousands of people, men, that Ukraine needs in the armed forces, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess I'm not really sure exactly what the motive behind necessarily the violently pulling into vans whenever men are just walking down the street is. But I do know that Ukraine is obviously facing a really hard time getting new recruits to come in. I've spoken with some people, some wives of soldiers that have said that they don't really see any other way that these men that are not joining the military can be brought in besides force. But I agree that it's definitely not the right way to go about it. And I think it's creating a lot of fear from Ukrainian men, but also a sort of hate in the government and just wanting for this war to be over, not really caring who wins anymore as long as they're safe. And I know that a lot of men are illegally trying to escape Ukraine, or they're paying thousands of dollars to get these white papers of exemption forms. And some of these things don't even work out. They end up spending all of their life savings just to try to be not drafted, and then it doesn't work.
Yeah, well, it's an area we've talked about before here, about the need for mobilisation, or the need for more people in the Ukrainian armed forces. So it's something we will keep a focus on. I mean, it's very difficult with these sort of so-called mobilisation police. We don't hear or see them very often, and it's such an emotive subject. So we will deal with it where we can, when we think we've got some verifiable information. But anyway, you've recently come back from front lines in Kharkiv and Pokrovsk areas. What was the mood in the trenches?
I think also one thing is that these soldiers I was spending time with in the Kharkiv region were saying that they don't even like these mobilization police, but not for the same reason. They don't like them because they said that at the beginning of the war, there were a lot of men that wanted to join the military, but that these mobilization officers told a lot of men to go home. And now they think that part of the reason why Ukraine doesn't have a lot of soldiers anymore is because all these people were turned away. But on the front lines right now, and throughout this whole year, actually, soldiers have been just telling me that they're tired and that they don't really have a break. Some of these men have been on their positions for a year at a time, and they're lucky if they even just get a few days off to just go and maybe get a haircut or just relax for maybe just a small amount of time, see their family before they're sent back to their position. And a lot of men, including when I was just there around 3 weeks ago, told me that they have a lack of weapons and a lack of ammunition, and that sometimes Russian soldiers have around 3 times the amount of weapons and ammunition that they do. And also some of these men volunteered to join territorial defense at the beginning of the war to protect their specific cities like Kyiv and Kharkiv. But 3 years they've been on the front lines in Bakhmut, in Avdiivka, and they're saying that this isn't really what they signed up for. They just wanted to protect their home and protect the people that they love and the cities that they love. But right now, they just feel like they are not really given any other opportunities besides just keep fighting. And I think that The Economist recently wrote an article that said that 60,000 to 100,000 soldiers have been killed in Ukraine. and around 400,000 have been injured. And I think that a lot of the people are just trying to hold on as best as they can, just making sure that they're not part of this statistic, but they don't know how long they can hold on for.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult when we've been there and when we've spoken to people. It is, how do we say this? The closer you get to the front, you're looking through a drinking straw, basically. You don't get to see the bigger picture. You can basically only report on and have a really good idea of as far as you can see in any direction. I found that when I was in the military union, we were relying on the journalists that came through and then reading their copy a few days later to actually see the bigger picture. And it's quite easy in those situations to have one fixed view and then not have any additional evidence to counteract it. But I think that certainly the message about being tired and the rotations is something that we've heard far and wide. Now, the war's approaching its 3-year mark. You've been around, well, across the whole country. How have you found the general mood between areas such as the front, as you say, Kharkiv, Donbass, Pokrovsk, and areas like Kyiv that are under a great threat, particularly from the air? But it's a different fight. It's a different type of war. It's a different side to the war. Have you detected, is there a shift? Is there a difference in spirit and mood between, dare I say it, the kind of rear areas or the big cities and the front?
When I was in Kharkiv recently, one volunteer medic told me that he actually doesn't like people from Kyiv because he doesn't feel like they are actually living in this war. And the same goes for Lviv because they're so far from the front lines. In October, I was speaking with a lot of Ukrainians about how they were feeling about the upcoming election. And what I found was that the people in Kyiv and the people in Lviv, they wanted Kamala Harris to be elected, but the people in Donbass or near the front lines, they actually wanted Trump to be elected as president because they thought that he could help to end the war because they don't see that it's been ending anytime soon with this current administration. I think that the people that I've gotten to know in the East, especially this year, have said that they're just tired, that they don't really care necessarily who wins right now as long as their cities are safe and as long as their families are safe, because a lot of these people have been living with this war for the last 10 years. So they just are tired of the fighting, they're tired of the destruction, and they just want to try to find some sort of normalcy in their lives again after, again, 3 years of the suffering just from this war alone.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult subject to broach and to discuss. And of course, we don't get any honesty from Russian society and Russian leadership. So it can be difficult sometimes to raise these subjects because you only really get this side of it. But we're not here just to give one view on this war. We're here to talk about it all. And that's the glorious messiness of democracy and a free press. Yeah, interesting. Now, let's start moving towards the end. Let's go with final thoughts. I've got a couple, actually, before I invite the other two in. Last Friday night, just before midnight, Donald Trump put out a tweet. We should do another study, actually. We did a lot of study in Trump 1 about when he was tweeting, and a lot of it seems to be around midnight in the early hours. But anyway, just before midnight on Friday, Saturday, he said, the idea that the BRICS countries, so BRICS being Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the idea that the BRICS countries are trying to move away from the dollar while we stand by and watch is over. In capital letters, over. We require a commitment from these countries that they will neither create a new BRICS currency nor back any other currency to replace the mighty US dollar, or they will face 100% tariffs and should expect to say goodbye to selling into the wonderful US economy. They can go find another sucker. There is no chance that the BRICS will replace the US dollar in international trade, and any country that tries should wave goodbye to America. Now, a couple of points on that. I wasn't sure that anybody was talking about a BRICS currency. I mean, the idea that there'd be some sort of combined currency between those countries, I wasn't aware that was even out there. However, I think it's interesting that he's talking about that. I've made this point before. I know a lot in America don't like the phrase global policeman, but that's the flip side of the coin to the phrase leader of the free world. And as I've said, if you want to be leader of the free world, then you need your currency, the dollar, to be the global reserve currency, as it is at the moment. So Donald Trump talking about fortress America, America first, just hiding behind a load of tariffs. I mean, China's renminbi, the yuan, be very happy. China will be very happy for their currency to be the global reserve currency. And I think it's interesting that Donald Trump is coming out talking about this thing that I wasn't even aware existed. The BRICS countries talking about forming their own currency. But if you want the US dollar to maintain its position as the global reserve currency, then that comes with responsibilities that aren't really met by sticking up a load of tariffs and retreating into America. Anyway, I thought that was an interesting intervention. Another second one for me, just final one for me. Syria. We try and stick to Ukraine and talk about international affairs through the lens of Ukraine, but it's impossible to see what's happening in Syria at the moment without realizing that some of it is connected. Assad's positions in Syria are largely held up by Hezbollah, Iran and Russia, and with them now largely absent, you've got to ask how secure the regime is. And for Russia, how secure is the Russian naval base at Tartus on the Med? They've got a 50-year lease there, but that is now under a lot of pressure. And I think it's just very interesting when you look at how all these points, all these global events are connected. We're not going to do a deep dive here and now into Syria. That's a little bit off range. But what's happening in Ukraine is having a direct impact elsewhere. And Hezbollah, I think, is the largest reason why the opposition forces made such advances over the weekend in Syria. But the absence of Russian forces is telling. I know the Russian Air Force has been active today. There's been a lot of bombing runs in Idlib and elsewhere. So that they're clearly still there. But I think the Russian force is much diminished, and that has contributed to this partial collapse in the northwest of the country. So definitely got to keep an eye on that. And of course, keep an eye on Georgia as well. But this is not battle lines. We can't go around the whole world picking fights. Coming up, we hear the team's final thoughts. Joe, have you got any final thoughts today, please?
Yeah, just one final thought for me, and just to speak about what NATO, or even partial NATO membership, could mean for Ukraine and liberating its leftover territory. I had a brief exchange with our friend and contributor, Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, on Saturday. And I said, look, it's a NATO membership for Ukraine, even partially, could be a smart way for NATO to end the war. But it does come with huge political restrictions for Ukraine. And it's one that the Ukrainians will be pondering themselves. Because if they were to take NATO membership, partial Article 5 coverage, it would restrict their ability to rebuild their armed forces and make another attempt at retaking the territory back that has been stolen from them by Russia. So is that one reason that NATO might say, look, okay, we're entertaining this idea. We're in the war. And two, we will stifle Ukraine's ability from starting or restarting a hot phase of this conflict, as Zelensky likes. But it's also one that the Ukrainians have to be wary of. They won't be able to, if one day down the line they find themselves in a position to liberate the parts of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, Kherson that are currently occupied and will be occupied under a ceasefire by Russia. They won't be able to take that back militarily if they do accept NATO membership. So yeah, diplomatic is the only way forward after that, and it does look unlikely. So yeah, interesting food for thought, I think.
Lovely. Thanks, Joe. As our guest today, Anna, welcome, as I say, to the pod. Would you like to close today's episode with your final thoughts?
Yes, I think that this topic of the mobilization efforts is something that Ukrainians are really wanting Western publications, Western media to cover, and they don't feel like their voices are really being heard. That's what I've heard from just the men that I've met over the last, 2 months is when it's been the most prevalent. And I wanted to mention that there's a quote from Taras Shevchenkov, which is the Ukrainian poet that is beloved throughout the country. And he says, when will Ukraine have its Washington with fair and just laws? Someday we will. And I think for a lot of Ukrainians, Zelensky is that leader, but others, they just want someone that's stronger, somebody that will help them feel that this war can end or that there will be some sort of change, because they don't really feel that with this mobilization police that they are really being heard and that they're really being considered and that it's not really fair and just. And I think that obviously men in Ukraine that are not serving in the military, they don't want Russia to win. They want Ukraine to be free. They want to get rid of this dark cloud that Ukraine has had over for hundreds of years of this Russian rule, but they're just wondering at what cost, because they're afraid. And I think that they just want people to remember that there's normal people in Ukraine that they don't really want to fight, but they don't want Ukraine to lose. And I think they're just wondering at what cost, because they don't want to die. They don't want to be injured. So I think it's a really important topic that deserves space in the media coverage of this war.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. I think it does. And I'm maybe a little surprised that somebody with the oratorial skills of Volodymyr Zelensky hasn't taken this to the public yet. You're right. Nobody wants to die in a war, but equally, as you say, the vast majority of people in Ukraine don't want Russia to be there, and it's difficult to square that circle. Someone's got to do the fighting and the dying. So it's an area we will return to again. It's a difficult one to discuss. I'm already getting bashed in my messages, Russian propaganda, etc., etc. Look, folks, if you want to go and listen to a podcast where we just say, hey, Ukraine's winning, it's brilliant, everything's fine, then they're out there. But we want to discuss things here like adults, and sometimes that means confronting some pretty difficult subjects head on, and we will do that. That's what we're here for. I wear my colours on my sleeve. You know how I want to win this war, but that doesn't mean that we don't turn over all the stones and discuss the dark things that we find underneath. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it's released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or leave comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.